Okay, I think we should start. We're already 1 minute late. I know breakfast is too good, and you need the energy to keep warm. We have 4 papers about institutions, and you will have about 50 minutes to talk, 4 minutes discussion, and then 10 minutes questions from the audience. So we stick to the plan that we got, and the first speaker is Cong Peng.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming in such a cold, chilled winter morning. This is really unexpected. Well, it's kind of like makes me feel homesick because I come from very cold places. Right. This paper looks into some historical facts, and we try to link the colonial history with today's urban structure in African cities. Our key findings include Francophone cities are in general more spatially compact in 5 dimensions. First, all else equal, Francophone cities have over about 45% less area. And if you look at the openness index they found in Birchfield paper in 2006, Francophone cities has 22% less openness. And in terms of roadblocks, Francophone cities has much more rectangular or regular or grid-like roadblocks. And in terms of road cover, Francophone cities has higher density development. And also, in terms of leapfrog development, in our paper, we define a novel measure that is the leapfrogment. We see British cities has about 72% higher count of leapfrog. There is a consequence of such differential urban structure. That is, leapfrog development tends to affect households' connection to public goods, such as electricity, home landlines, piped water, and the city sewage system. Why is that? The possible channels we identified are institutions. There are 3 aspects. First, British has a common law system, while the French has the civil law system. Civil law is associated with a heavier hand of government ownership and regulation than common law. Second, that is the direct rule versus indirect rule during the colonial period. The French are much direct in terms of regularized urban land, and the British under a dual mandate system, and they sit aside as advisor instead of urban governor. And these differences in institutions persist until today, and causes the differences we see. There is a huge literature on studying the institutional differences between Francophone and Anglophone. I'm going to skip this part here. So let's talk about our research design. There are 2 challenges, and this research design has 2 steps. The first, we try to separate out the institutional influence from the physical influence. When looking at urban structure, it's hard to separate out the intangible institutional influence from the historical physical influence of urban planning. Our strategy is to divide cities into 2 portions. One is colonial portion, which is in the very core in the old town, and the extensive margin, which emerged mostly after the colonial period. The context here is in 111 cities, population grew about 5 times from 1960 to 2000. So there is a huge extensive margin. And we are thinking the differences in the colonial core is driving the differences in the extensive margin, even after the colonial period's end. Our second step is to run a border experiment. Although we can argue that colonial a region could be happenstance. However, different geography could still drive the differences in the shape of cities. So we look into the cities that are within 100 kilometers from the borderline between Anglophone countries and Francophone countries. And we look into the differences in terms of urban structure. We did this in West Africa. The basic empiric framework is as follows. So the outcome variable is openness or area in 2014, and or leapfrogment from 1990s to 2000, and from 2000 to 2014. The outcome of interest is Anglophone dummy, which captures the differential of different measurements between Anglophone cities and Francophone cities. So this is the distribution of our sample cities. We have about 28 countries with 15 former colonial British colonies and 13 former French colonies. We have 333 cities with about 100 Francophone cities. In terms of data, our land use data comes from a global human capital layer that is 38 meter by 38 meter satellite image with a pretty high resolution. So this data comes in 4 periods, and we focus on 1990, 2000, and 2014. Our city sample comes from Nightlight. Basically, if this area is continuously lit for at least 2 years out of the last 5 years from 2008 to 2012, we define it as a city. We have a rich list of geographic controls, including recognized elevation, access to water, rainfall, and we also estimated city population in 1990. So here are the results. I'm going to report our results in 3 sections. The first is overall pattern. Then we go to the colonial portion. Then we go to the extensive margin, where we argue that's where we achieved our identification of the institutional effect. So in the overall pattern part, you see that this is the Bushfield openness index. Anglophone cities have significantly higher openness index. And if you run regression, Anglophone cities have about 22% higher openness index and 45% higher of area, which is essentially defined by light, given our rich control list. Then we dive into the colonial sections. Here we find 40 cities with a population above 300,000. And we collected its old roadblock maps from Oxford and Cambridge library. In these 2 maps, the left is Anglophone Accra, and the right is Francophone Bamako. And the right lines are the roadblocks dating back to 1960s. So as you can see that Anglophone cities has much irregular roadblocks, while Francophone cities have much more regular roadblocks, and this persists even 50 years later. Right. We see this very similar pattern in other cities. And to quantify this measure, we look into our rectangularity index. So we define rectangularity as how it is grid-like. And here is the result. Except for Sudan, most Anglophone cities has much higher share of grid-like structure. And if you look at the build-up intensity by looking into rings coming out from city center, then we see that Angfeng cities have about 37 to 78% fewer built places. Then we dive into the extensive margin, where we look into the flow of new patches. In the gray area, you can posit it as a colonial portion of the city, while the red, blue, and green are the new built up in the next decade. And we classify them into 3 types. The red types are the infill, and the blue part is the extension, and the green part is leapfrog, based on a buffer surrounding the patch with the existing development. So for leapfrog, this intersection between the buffer and the existing patch is 0. So we found that in Angfeng cities, there are about 72% higher of such leapfrog development. And if you look at the portion of leapfrog development to all the other patches developed, there are still about 27% higher in Angfeng cities. However, if you look at the average area of such patches, there is basically no difference. To pin down this our identification, we run such border experiment. In West Africa, we identify 5 Anglo cities and looking at the borderline with Frankfurt cities. We further cluster these cities into 15 small clusters, as you can see in this colored area. So the results remains, which gives us confidence to say that there is a causal link between the institution difference and the city structure. And we run a lot of robustness checks to see how this effects vary across samples, countries, and the different measurements. Here I want to point out in column 5, we drop all former German colonies, right? And the effect remain. We also look at cities that are founded after 18th century. That's where the colonial power came in, right? And these cities are established after the strong influence of colonial powers. And this coefficient is much larger. It's about 2.6. And however, the effect remains strong if we kick out these cities that are established after 18th century. And in the 40 cities that we used for identifying the rectangularity, the effect is still strong. So there is a consequence. That is, if we use DHS data to look at in each household how many leapfrog development there are in its 2 kilometers neighborhood, and you run such a regression, you basically see that if there is more leapfrog development, there is less possibility of connected to important public goods, such as electricity, phone line, tap water, and city sewage system. So in conclude, we found that Frankfurt cities are more compact than Anglophone cities. It has less openness, smaller spatial extent of city. So in the old colonial portion, we see much more great area road structure, much more intense development near the center. In the extensive margin, we see less leapfrogment and less disconnected development. And we attribute this effect into the persistence of institutions. There is a policy consequence that is deep frog development is less likely to receive connections to public utilities such as electricity, phone landline, tap water, and city sewers. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also great timing. I didn't need to show any cards. Except one, but you were really on a good track. So I think this is a great paper. It's a really great paper. It takes it essentially, this literature, to a new level, because what people did before is looking at city size. Now you're zooming in and essentially looking at the form of cities, and not just the geometric features, but whether they're gridded. And in terms of outcomes, this is really interesting because you would expect that it affects the costs of public service provision. That's what you showed in the last table. So I think that's great work. It's a compact work. It's a lot of work went into it, very detailed as well. You fought hard about identification. So this is all good, and I just want to add 2 points where I think I would be quibble a bit. So the first thing is, what's really the source of persistence? Your French direct rule is like a black box, right? This is your dummy variable, you keep it like that. But the issue is, when I think about colonial, and you say colonial, that's persistent, so colonial cannot be changed. That's a problem from a policy point of view, because you cannot change your history, so it's interesting that you point to this issue, but what shall we do about this? And actually, I think you can do much more to think about the sources of persistence and to open this black box. What are the sources? And you do it a bit, but I think you could do it a bit more. And what I have in mind is, for example, is it really indirect rule? So you pointed already to the French rule that in parts they have direct rule, but in some countries it's a very mixed form. So you have actually regions where the chiefs were in power and they decided more or less what to do. I think you can put another small exercise into your paper, looking, for example, at Côte d'Ivoire and comparing those regions within French under French rule, and where the chiefs had something to say. Now, opening the sources of persistence. So you said land, okay? You need to have land for development. Are there issues about property rights? So you said the French, they were more inclined to get some, to get urban land under their control. So this would be interesting, whether this is a land issue. Because if it's a land issue, you can think, okay, maybe we cannot do much about it. The other thing is, and this is when you work with bureaucracies, there's a lot of persistence, and I mean, it's the same people who just continue from colonial times to independence, and they just continue going on. So this is essentially some kind of persistence of the urban planning departments, and this means possibly you can change something, right? Second thing, sunk costs, and this brings me a bit, once you have this non-grid structure, it's very costly to change. Now you're showing already, well, you have this leapfrogging, so even in newly developed lands, you get dispersion. But nevertheless, sunk cost is something like, you could look a bit deeper into it, because it's also about, where these cities newly created. And my feeling would be that the British cities, they are oldest, they take on the form. Once you already have a kind of a settlement there, you don't start out with a gridded system. And I think you could do a bit more, because it's a funny definition where you say post-1800, that's colonial. I thought, well, it starts in 1890. And actually, there are some cities that are, or some parts of the cities that are built by scratch. So I thought you could do a bit more on thinking about sunk costs. The last point that I want to point at, so are there any turnarounds? Okay, are there any turnarounds? If it's persistence and you don't find any example of where planning departments manage to get into a better shape of road structures, So you could learn from those cases. Okay, so this is persistence in some way, but you say actually things can be changed, and this is a kind of a case study where it can be changed. So this is what I wanted to put on and ask you to think a bit more about these issues, because they're important in terms of what can be done. Otherwise, it's like a paper on colonial matters. It's interesting, but we cannot change much about it. So it's history. It's gone. Why would we care about this? Other than there's persistence. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's a great comment. So, for the black box, it is kind of like a black box. We try to disentangle the black box by looking into the urban planning trainings in Africa. But we try to describe the website of universities in Africa, but it seems like they don't really post their staff information online. So that's now we have such a data issue. It would be happy to know if there is any measurement on measure the training of those urban planners in Angfeng cities and Francophone cities. That's if you can help, that would be highly appreciated. I think that's one angle we try to disentangle the black box. Another is definitely land right, and there are many papers on land right. Well, we feel like this is already a paper, so we didn't go that I think that could be another paper basically. And for the sunk cost, yeah, sure it is. We are looking into cities that are started from scratch. Right, we have looked into cities that are founded after 18th century, but maybe we can look even newer, right? I think that's definitely something we can do, that's in our data. And for turnaround, we actually have some cities in the border. Here in this part, there is a formal Angfeng colony in Nigeria. And later on, they were incorporated into Cameroon. So there might be some turnaround in that area. I think that's something maybe we can look at. Is that what you mean? Maybe. Right. So that's my.
That's good. That's good. So we have 6 minutes, 7 minutes for questions, please. Any questions? Yes, please.
I wonder how important the maybe endogenous creation of preferences comes into this. That if you, in terms of people going to the former colonial powers, if you go to Paris and you go to London, you see very different cities, and that at least among the elites in these countries, that may help generate a preference for a Hyde Park or a preference for a strong grid structure, and which might be one of the sources of the persistence. I don't know if there's a way to think about that. Maybe it's different for Liberia or the former German colonies.
Yeah, we had a plan to look at how the urban structure are different, just in the UK and in France. I am now based on London and based on my rough observation. I feel like it's pretty much the case. I think in London, I think the road structure are much laissez-faire. That's my personal experience. There's more dangles. There is less greater planning, shown in London, I think, compared to Paris. Well, yeah, right. I think we can like do such a experiment. Yeah.
Other questions? I also have another one. So you did not really talk about slums, but when I think about the form of blocks, I would say when I think about slums, this is super irregular. So I was wondering whether you actually have something to say about differences in the extent of whether what you are catching up with your irregularity are differences in slums, because you haven't talked about this at all, but it would fit kind of with your story. Have you thought about this? So that your irregular shapes may just give reflect a higher prevalence of slums in British former British colonies, cities.
Yeah, I think that's something we actually should look like. But I think we didn't. I mean, in our sample, there are so many leapfrogs, but I don't think most of them are slums. I think the slums are just a very small portion. And also, most slums are actually located in the city center. Right? It's not in the leapfrog extensive margin we are looking at. So that is a concern we should check. But arguably, I think slums are more concentrated in the city center, and we are actually looking at the outskirts.
Okay, any other questions? So, last chance. Okay, so then let's go on.
Thank you very much.
To the second presentation by Gwen-Jiro Clochard.
All right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Gwen-Jiro Clochard. I'm a research assistant at CREST and École Polytechnique. And I'll be presenting the work I did for my master's thesis last year. It's a joint work with Guillaume Hollard, who will be my PhD supervisor starting next year. So basically, we're trying to look at the link between ethnic diversity and the provision of public goods. So as you know, it is widely thought that in most of the world, many parts of the world, communities play a major role in providing public goods, especially local public goods. And according to literature, again, this role is even bigger and even larger in Africa. And due in large part to a paper by Easterly Levine in 1997 called Africa's Growth Tragedy, ethnic diversity is widely thought to have an adverse impact on the provision of public goods. So that's what we'll be focusing on today. So this paper is now more than 20 years old, and since then there have been many improvements. First of all, there are much larger and much more reliable data sets available. We have better econometric analysis, and we have a better understanding of the channels through which ethnic diversity could affect the provision of public goods. What are our objectives? Our objective in this paper is to re-examine the link between ethnic diversity and the provision of public goods by using data at the individual level. I'll mention it in a minute, but in previous papers they used mostly country-level statistics. We'll be increasing measurement precision because we can now calculate the ethnic diversity indexes at the region level. Thus, we could include country-fixed effects. And that's the third part is what I'm going to focus on in depth today, is the instrumental variable approach to get a causal link between ethnic diversity and the provision of public goods. And we'll also be observing the effects on the large set of public goods. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the literature, because this paper is, the whole literature basically is based on one paper by Easterly Levine in 1997 that's called Africa's Growth Tragedy. And what they do is they observe huge differences in growth rates across the world since the end of the Second World War, and since the 60s in fact. And they link it with the characteristics, especially of sub-Saharan African societies, which is ethnic diversity. And what they find is a very negative correlation between ethnic diversity and the provision of public goods. It's roughly in the magnitude of 2% GDP per year, from going from a perfectly homogeneous to a perfectly heterogeneous society. The second paper, which was influential, it's the work by Alice Nayal in 2003. They had another paper in 1999. I'll talk about briefly, maybe if I have time later on. And they link the provision of public goods to ethnic diversity in, well, basically the whole world. And what they found, again, is a very negative impact of ethnic diversity, negative correlation between ethnic diversity and the provision of public goods. But these papers have limits. There are, well, three basic limits. The first one is, well, due to the lack of availability of data at the time, they only look at data at the country level, which has two drawbacks. First of all, it doesn't allow for country fixed effects, which could include many unobservable country-level characteristics. And also, it doesn't allow to look for discrepancies within, differences within countries. There are limited robustness checks, again, due to, in large part, to the lack of availability of data. And there is no argument or limited argument for causality identification. And that's the part I'm going to focus on today. Since then, the literature, there are three main blocks. There are many papers who found that ethnic diversity in many contexts, in many countries, has been found to be negatively linked, negatively correlated with the provision of public goods, lower spending on school, roads, higher child mortality. But even early papers found out that the relationship is not unconditional. For instance, the paper by Collier in 2000, they find that even if in the presence of good institutions, the relationship between ethnic diversity and provision of public goods could disappear. And we have even more recent papers, or even more recent ones that have been published since then, that have sort of found the opposite result. That is, that ethnic diversity could be positively linked to the provision of public goods. So what I'm going to focus on this morning is on the causal impact of ethnic diversity. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the data, because what I've mentioned already several times that in previous papers, one of the issues was that data was not available. Now we have much more reliable data available. And what we'll be using here is the Afrobarometer Round 6 data, which gives us data for more than 50,000 people in 36 African countries. And we'll be using geographical historic homelands, also computed by Nen and Wanchikun, that's extracted from the Murdoch's Atlas. And we also have geographic information about suitability of soil to agriculture, etc. I'll talk about this. What are our variables of interest? So we're looking at the impact of ethnic diversity on a very large set of public goods. We have 10 public goods here. I'll get in the details in a moment. So our instruments. So first of all, we measure the ethnic diversity with the standard ethnic fractionalization index. It's sometimes called Ethno-Linguistic Fractionalization Index. So basically, this index captures the probability of two randomly picked individuals of belonging to different ethnic groups. So if the coefficient is 0, that means that the society is perfectly homogeneous. If the coefficient is 1, then we have perfect heterogeneity. What we'll be using here is we'll be using pre-colonial territories because if you compare the two maps, which are the historic homelands maps and the actual borders of African countries, you can see that the two have pretty much nothing in common. I'll get to this in a moment. So basically what we do is that for each historic homeland, so we have data at the around 5 kilometers, 5 times kilometers pixels, and so much less precise than the previous paper. So basically what we do is we approximate, because we don't have data on this, we approximate pre-colonial population to the area controlled by the group. And for each current and present-day region, so what we do is we calculate the fractionalization index in pre-colonial times. So if you look at the formula, it's just that because of the non-availability of the population in pre-colonial times, we use, instead of the share of the ethnic group in the population, basically we have the share of the area controlled by the group in the whole region. And then what we do is we instrument the current fractionalization with the pre-colonial measure in the regressions. So how is this relevant? So according to some literature, in pre-colonial times, we had African society which was characterized by low density, very few cities, and little ethnic diversity. But with movements, population movements, induced either by forced migration or the creation of cities, the society became more diverse all around Africa. And basically what the underlying idea of our paper is that if migration took place in an area which was around which there were many ethnic groups, it's more likely that the area is more diverse today than if the migration took place in an area which was sort of homogeneous. So, but of course, because we're looking at pre-colonial data, we want to avoid anything that could affect both the provision of public goods and population movements. So, first of all, to construct a good instrument, you need to focus on reverse causality, which could mean that population movements and, in turn, ethnic fractionalization could be influenced by the existence of public goods. For instance, if you think of states. Thank you. And so we use pre-colonial data. So this was a time when the public goods that we are focusing on didn't really exist, but we are still controlling for pre-colonial institutions which could very well influence both population movements and the provision of public goods today. They have been found to be linked. Then we look at third factors. We control for, as I mentioned, pre-colonial institutions. We also control for land suitability for agriculture and access to river streams and oceans. Why do we do that? That's because basically land suitability for agriculture, for instance, it could mean that it could influence population movements, because agricultural populations could come to these areas because the soil is richer, and in turn, because the soil is richer, you can get more wealth, and therefore you can have better capacity to produce public goods. So we control for this. We also control for rivers, exactly for the same reason, and we also control for measurement error. Well, we try to control for this. We know that there are many issues regarding the ethno-linguistic fractionalization index, and so we'll also control for region area and region populations, just to avoid miscalculation of the index, basically meaning that we look at not to capture artificial fractionalization and diversity. Our regression framework is a standard instrument variable framework. We use country fixed effect. We could account for much of the policies at the nation level. And so basically our results in, I'm going to go a little bit faster now. The first test regressions we can use our instrument is highly statistically significant. And so what we find first for the 5 first public goods, we find that the standard negative impact of ethnic diversity is confirmed for those first 5 public goods. But for the rest, we have a sort of a mixed feeling, so we still find the negative impact for pipe water system and sewage treatment facilities, but for post offices, we see that the effect sort of disappears. And what is even more puzzling is that for electricity grid and cell phone coverage, we find a positive causal impact of ethnic diversity on the provision of public goods, which is sort of puzzling if you think about the literature. But more importantly, even if you don't really consider the 2 public goods which are positively affected by ethnic diversity, you see that even if you look at the right-hand side coefficients, they vary widely between public goods. And so that's call for a better understanding. So basically, to wrap up, I would say that the diversity burden overall seems to be hypothesis seems to be valid. However, we find that for 2 public goods, which are the electricity grid and cell phone coverage, the impact of ethnic diversity is positive. And so basically, the result for Mr. Levine does appear to be overall valid, but not unconditionally. And so to go further, I would say that this paper calls, and that's what we're working on right now, is this calls for a better understanding of the channels through which ethnic diversity affects the provision of public goods, and especially through which a form of diversity dividend could arise. So we're looking at right now public good characteristics. It looks like returns to scale could play a major role. Okay, and I'm be concluding. We need to conduct more robustness checks, and maybe there's evidence that this is not hopeless and it could be overcome ethnic diversity through trust. I'll be more than happy to discuss this. Thank you for your attention.
Right, I think it's a great paper. I really like the writing. It's very clear and very informing. I have 2 suggestions as 2 questions. The first suggestion is, I think in the 6th Afrobarometer there is geocoded data, right? Maybe with that information and with the boundary of the Modoc map in 1967, you can just dive into the city level. I mean, it can go much deeper, I think. And also, you could also look at DHS data. My second suggestion, there are also a bunch of measures on public good provision. Basically what, in our paper, all of the public good provision is from DHS data. The problem is that it might have a 2 kilometers distortion, but I think it's still in a final level in that regard. So 2 questions. First, I think on the China side, one possible China could be the conflict between tribes and different ethnic groups. So I think Afrobarometer data also provides many measures on conflict and their attitude on local policies. So maybe that can help. But I think, yeah, maybe you can show how conflicts could be one channel. On the other hand, another question is on the IV part. So I think it might be helpful if you can show how historical EFI index only affect current EFI index, right? And only through that channel it comes into public good provision. Maybe you can show some, just uncorrelated effect between the historic EFI index with some indicators of today. Right, that's my comment. Thanks.
All right, so thank you very much for your remarks. Regarding the geocode data in the Afrobarometer, we tried to look at this. There's a little bit of difficulties that the level in the Afrobarometer of disaggregation is not the same for every country. That's why we didn't use this for this paper yet. Maybe we'll try to use it. That's a good remark. Regarding DHS data, we will look at this. We will also look at new data from Gershman Rivera. Well, they're based on the DHS data also, but they have a very detailed work on ethno-linguistic fractionalization and different levels of fractionalization. Basically, what you mean with the possible errors induced by the geocode in the DHS, which is 2 kilometers. Our instrument basically has pixels which are 5 kilometers wide, so 2 kilometers would be in the same area. So it wouldn't be such an issue. Regarding the channels, yes, conflicts. We tried to look at this. Again, there are somehow the issue is that the questions are not asked in all of the countries. There are some countries in which it's not asked, but maybe we could reduce the data sets a little bit. And yes, the conflicts between ethnic groups, the history of conflicts could very well affect the provision of public goods and preferences as well. So yes, we'll take this into account. And there's also in the Afrobarometer the idea in some countries they have a measure of salience of ethnic diversity, which is do you feel more Senegalese than you feel your ethnic group? And so maybe this would be a refinement of the measure we could very well use. So yes. And regarding the causality, the IV implication that the instrument is not linked with current factors, yes, that's a very good point, and I'll look into that. Thank you.
Okay, we have 10 minutes for questions. Oh, yes, please.
So part of this literature that has looked at within countries before has pointed out the difference between countries where there's, more of a nation-state building approach versus kind of, so I'm thinking of, Mary Kate Gugati and Ted Miguel's work in, comparing Kenya and Tanzania and saying that ethnic diversity matters in one place but not in the other because of this different history of building a national identity. And we found similar work in Sierra Leone when we did it there. So in a sense, rather than trying to say what is the average effect across Africa, I think it's might be more interesting to delve into why do you find it in some places and not in others. I don't know whether any of that explains why you get positive effects and others. So I just wondered if you thought about breaking that up, where does it matter and where does it not matter? The other thing is on your list of public goods, some of those are provided locally and some of those are not provided locally. So you would expect the mechanisms to be a bit different there.
Yes. So regarding your question about so why this happens in some areas in why it doesn't, so you're right, this is a cross-country comparison. So basically what we do is we compare, we look at average effects around Africa, and I think that's definitely something worth looking at. We didn't look at this in this paper. We actually we're trying right now to implement solutions to overcome the ethnic diversity burden in some sense. For instance, the paper I'm quoting here by Ola and Sen found that in at the local level, if the communities trust each other, and the question is how, historically they've come to trust each other in spite of ethnic diversities. In spite of ethnic diversity, the effect of ethnic diversity seems to disappear. So that could be one possible reason why ethnic diversity affects in some areas and why not in others. But of course, there's going to be there's a need for much more understanding on why, for instance, if trust plays a role, why in some areas trust was more built. Yes, yeah, of course. Yes, exactly. Yeah, I agree. And sorry, what was your second question again? Yes, exactly. Yes, so actually we were quite puzzled by the results, and so we're looking at, right now, at public good characteristics. I mentioned returns to scale, but we also try to incorporate in a model the different scale at which the public good is provided, which of course plays a major role. We also are trying to link it with characteristics which are, in the standard public good theory, which are, for instance, excludability. Again, if you think about if you think about languages, it doesn't really matter if the electricity provider has only members of one group who doesn't speak the same language as their customers. But if you're thinking about school, the fact that the school is taught in a certain language, if you don't speak that language, that could affect you much more, and therefore the impact of diversity could be very well different between different public goods. So that's one thing we're working on right now, is to understand why do we observe so much heterogeneity in the impact of public good, of ethnic diversity on the public good. Thank you. Another question?
Any other questions? Yes, please. We go from bottom to the top. So Marcel is second.
So this is related to the same question, that some of the public goods are provided locally and some are not. One thing you could do is control, identify which of these districts belong to the same admin 1 region. I don't know if you're using the admin 1, admin 2 classification, but some of them belong to the larger province. So if you could control for that factor, and then you could probably isolate the local goods provision part. And one other thing I was thinking was, I have a working paper where we look at pre-colonial political institutions and the spillovers of economic shocks. And what we find is that if pre-colonial political institutions, or rather the level of pre-colonial political institutions is higher, the region has the ability to absorb economic shocks to a greater level, as opposed to regions with low levels of pre-colonial political institutions. So I'm just wondering if the same kind of thing, like the spillovers or spillovers is something that you can capture in terms of public good provision. Like maybe if you are located next to a neighbor, let's say your neighbor has high levels of public good provision, maybe that acts as an incentive for your own public good provision to increase. Just a suggestion, maybe you could think about the spillover effects.
Yes. So that's very good point about spillovers. I'll try to see. I haven't looked at it. I'll try to see if we can incorporate this in the study. But that's a very good point, and also the point of who's in charge of distributing, of choosing the development of the public good coverage. That's something we can possibly control. It's very likely that we can control for this, and that's could be very interesting. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have another question. Marcel.
Yes.
So my question was, one thing that struck me when I started traveling in Africa is how similar people are over this very, very large continent. Right?
Yes.
And then later on I discovered, and not just in terms of external appearance, but also in terms of institutions. There are lots of common institutions. There are differences, obviously there are differences, but there are lots of common institutions. And then, when I tried to figure out why that was the case, is because I realized there was this thing called Bantu-Niger migrations, which started, 4,000, 6,000 years ago, maybe at the most, and spread from Cameroon, Nigeria, all the way to Senegal, and eventually reached South Africa. And they reached South Africa maximum 1,000 years ago, perhaps even as recently as 500 years ago. So I'm thinking, where is this ethnic diversity coming from? In other words, it's all being engineered very rapidly.
Yes.
If you go to Europe, there's lots and lots of differences, massive differences across the different places. Right? And the same thing if you go to Americas. Nobody was there before. 14,000 years ago, maybe 12,000 years ago, and then suddenly you have all this diversity. So clearly, this ethnic diversity that you observe is being created. It would be kind of interesting to figure out where it's coming from, especially if you go all the way to South Africa or Southern Africa, where this Bantu-Niger flows of migration came very recently. So I'm wondering, is it because they're arriving there, then they fight over the land, and they try to differentiate themselves? And so is it something but it's not something that's given. It's something that was created. That's all.
Yes.
Can I add a point to what Marcel said? Yes, I think there are many factors. One question I have is, what do you mean by pre-colonial times for countries which have never been colonized? One. Two, there are different factors. For instance, if you take Ethiopia, if I remember my first year history very well, the migration has been due to religious conflicts between Christians and Muslims, and drought, demographic pressures. So I think it is good, by way of comment, to delve more into what really drives the migration.
Okay, we have 1 minute for an answer.
So just... so first, regarding the question of where diversity comes from, I don't have a clear answer about this. And clearly, all of this literature is based on the fact that basically groups are considered as, coming from the sky and coming from nowhere. And there's this paper by Gershman Rivera doesn't look at the formation of ethnic diversity, but looks at whether this observed heterogeneity comes from, different level of aggregation, because somehow the disaggregation into different groups is a bit arbitrary. I mean, you decide that these two groups, especially in the Murdoch's Atlas, which most of the literature comes from. In this literature, Hutus and Tutsi in Rwanda were considered the same ethnic group, which obviously history has proven wrong. But so basically, I don't have a clear answer of where does this come from and why do we see that this has such an important effect on people's lives, where these are clearly human constructions. I mean, ethnic diversity doesn't come from the sky or whatever. So that's a very interesting question. I really don't have any answer. For the answer, the pre-colonial data, it dates to basically dates to the work of Murdoch, which was in the 50s and 60s. I'm not 100% sure on how they look at countries which have never been colonized. From what I can say is that in our data sets, for instance, Ethiopia is not in the data sets. But of course, that's something that would be very interesting to look at. Okay, and the factors of migration, just to conclude, the factors of migration, we have an individual measure of how deeply religious people are and how the regions are heterogeneous in terms of religion. But of course, we could maybe look at migration and religion in the data and in pre-colonial data. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So let's go on to the next speaker, Owen, Ozier.
Thanks very much. It's probably good. I want to make a comment. First, unlike the other papers in this session, this is not an epic paper about hundreds of years of history and dozens of countries and that sort of thing. If you wanted to see that, my paper on that was yesterday. And it was presented by Pam Jakila, and it was about gender, which was good that it was presented yesterday, not today, given the remarkable composition of our panel this morning. So, thanks everyone for coming. It's a narrow topic, but I think it has important lessons. It's about improving bureaucratic performance in health clinics in Nigeria. This is joint work with Varun Gori at the World Bank, Julian Jameson, who's soon to be at Exeter University, and Nina Majar, who is at Boston University. And again, I'm Owen Ozier from the research group at the World Bank. If you got a chance to see David Evans' presentation yesterday, you would have seen a beautiful graph in which he shows that even controlling for the level of income, or as you'd like it, the measure of GDP per capita in Nigeria, outcomes in terms of things like mortality in the health system in Nigeria are quite bad. And so, given that situation, there are lots of dimensions along which you might think one could set about trying to improve the situation in the health clinics in Nigeria. This paper grew out of an effort by the World Bank in which there was an engagement with the Ministry of Health in Nigeria. And one of the challenges is that at different levels of the ministry, at the federal level, at the state level, and then down to the more local level, it was quite hard to get a sense of what was known about the facility level activities at the central level. So information didn't seem to be flowing very well. So this grew out of a project to basically create documentation and move that documentation and match that documentation up and down the chain through which resources should flow. So, of course, this is a relatively resource-constrained setting. And so one question is, what can you do that's relatively inexpensive? And in relation to anything that you can do, conceived of as an intervention, there's a question of whether an RCT, a randomized trial of an intervention, teaches us something that we can take elsewhere, teaches us something whose findings are portable. And there are a number of papers on that topic covering a variety of different interventions. Hunt Alcott's work in the United States, Tessa Bold, Justin Sandifer, several co-authors working in Kenya. Rachel Glennerster is here today. Her paper with Mary Ann Bates basically argues that you've got to start with a theory for why a thing should work in a place. Then you should check whether the thing has the preconditions for working in that place, and then ask what the strength of the evidence is. And randomized trials can contribute to strong evidence in such a framework. So I'm going to come back to that as I talk about this. We had an opportunity in this project to work simultaneously with the same implementing organization to do the exact same thing in randomized trials in 2 states in Nigeria. So on the one hand, you might think of this as within a single country, but states in Nigeria can be quite different from one another. So this is going to take place in both Ekiti State and Niger State, which are on this map. The most obvious thing that you could quickly glean from this map is that the population density is quite a bit lower in Niger State, there on the border with Benin, than it is in Ekiti. That's only one of many differences. So here I'm showing you a graph from the demographic and health surveys of the fraction of women with no formal schooling. You can pick any statistic and you can find kind of an interesting picture, but I wanted to show this one because I think it communicates very clearly. Highlighted in blue here on the right is Ekiti State. Something like 2% of women, it's very small, have no formal education. Niger State is way over there on the left with more than 60% having no formal schooling. So those are far above and far below the averages for Nigeria. And to give you a sense of what countries that looks like, here's a graph of all of the countries in the demographic and health surveys in the last decade. And what you can see here is that Ekiti looks something like a middle-income country. Ekiti looks like a Peru or a Philippines, way out here on the right. Whereas Niger looks more like a Burkina Faso or a Benin, its neighbors. So these are really different contexts. And as I mentioned, this larger project was trying to introduce simple forms that would track income and expenditure streams and allow them to be matched across the levels of the health system in Nigeria. What this in practice meant was bringing forms to health clinics and checking them on a weekly basis. But what's the incentive that somebody in a health facility has to fill out a form? They probably have lots of forms to fill out. What's one more form? So we just wanted to know whether or not they were filling out the form well. That was the really simple question. Can we improve, as researchers, this was our small role in this project, can we improve how well this form gets filled out without spending a whole lot of money on the enterprise? So there are various characteristics you might include in how well the form is getting filled out. And there are lots of papers written about what people's intrinsic and extrinsic motivations might be and what might crowd in or crowd out different sources of motivation. The intervention that we're going to do is pretty similar to that studied by Ashraf, Bandiera, and Jack in Zambia, in which stars are put up in a visible place to sort of reward, without any financial compensation, people for doing the thing that is desired, in this case, selling female condoms in Zambia. In our study, we just want the checklist to get a high score. We want this form that describes transactions at the facility level, whether resources have arrived, whether drugs have been sold, how many people have come by. We want this to be filled out carefully. And so we make a score from 0 to 5, and it corresponds to stars. And this is the really, really simple thing that we do. We stick this certificate on the wall of the clinic, okay? That's the sum total of the intervention. Somebody comes to the clinic, looks at the form, and if it's filled out well, this 5-star thing goes on the wall. And if it's filled out poorly, a 0-star thing goes on the wall or somewhere in between. At all clinics in the treatment and the comparison groups, somebody's coming by on a weekly basis to gather the form and then also to assess its quality, but only in one arm does this thing go on the wall. In conversations with the Ministry of Health, it was desirable to do the same thing in both states. So we have 65 facilities that we started working with in Ekiti, 75 in Niger, and we randomized within both the exact same intervention. We have 5 weeks of observation, which is a pretty short time frame. We start with a baseline week, and then there are 4 weeks during which the intervention is ongoing, and that's the only data that we're going to use. Here's the short story of our results. In Niger, this is the percent score, the treatment is the blue line, the comparison is the dotted gray line. Nothing happens. Nothing at all. Doesn't really get that much better over time. It doesn't really get better or worse between treatment and comparison groups. In Ekiti, as soon as this thing starts, we see movement. Okay, so in Ekiti, putting the star on the wall seems to have sort of cut the distance from the comparison group to perfect scores in half or even better. It seems like it's made a huge improvement. So, how are these places different? There's a big table of the many ways they're different. The left part is Ekiti, the right part is Niger. There's a p-value for differences. The top panel is to give you a general sense of things like, is there electricity available at the facilities? Well, 37% in Ekiti, 27% in Niger, so they're a little different, but not statistically. That top panel is just to give you a general sense of the context. The next 9 things down below are the things that, in conversation with my co-authors, we thought might have some plausible role in the theory of why an intervention would work or would not work. So when we think about when you're busy, you sort of face a situation of scarcity of your own resources, mentally and otherwise, and so that may lead you to focus on short-term things, or it may, and so if this stars on the wall thing is seen as a short-term thing, that could help this intervention work, or if there are other higher, sort of more pressing short-term things, then this stars thing on the wall could actually matter even less in busy places. So what's a measure of busyness? We have the number of monthly outpatients. We have the number of days open per week. There are some things like that, the population density. What about the gender ratio, either of the patients at the facility or the staff at the facility? Well, there's literature that suggests that if you see this as a competition to get stars on the wall, maybe women are less likely in some papers to be interested in competing. And so maybe the gender ratio, either, let's say, of the staff at the facility might influence things that way. Or alternatively, there are literatures that suggest women, both at the patient side and at the provider side, may be more pro-social and more willing to do things that are going to help others. And so doing this thing well might be seen in that light. So maybe actually it's going to go the other way. So for each of these things, having a staff member for financial accounting, the patient education, whether or not so a highly educated patient population could look at this thing on the wall, read it, and say, wow, you're really doing a great job, or what's wrong with your facility? So maybe patient education helps. On the other hand, maybe the higher educated patients could equally well be more busy, face a higher opportunity cost of time, and so then be disinclined to give feedback to the facility. So for each thing here, we were able to tell ourselves, before we looked at the data, a theoretical story that honestly could go in either direction. So what we're going to want to do, test of balance, I'm going to show you the regression form of the result in Akiti, and then what we're going to ask is, does any of those covariates predict the treatment effect heterogeneity in Akiti, where we've got an effect to take apart? And then if it does, I'm going to want to know, does that then explain the difference between the effect we see in Akiti and the non-effect we see in Niger? Okay? Simple exercise. And we were relatively constrained, again, by the way that we came into this exercise in what variables we had to look at. So I've given you that list. They're not atypical for facility surveys that you might come across, but we could all imagine other things that it would have been nice to have on that list that we didn't have. Okay. So the first column is your basic regression. I'm regressing the score and sort of the quality with which you filled out this form on social recognition, which is a treatment dummy. Okay, and this is going to be conditional on having anything interesting to fill out in the form. If you've got no transactions that should go on the form in a given week, then there's nothing really to fill out, and that's not different across treatment arms. Okay, so there's that sort of 12 percentage point increase, and that's what you saw in the picture in Akiti. The second column includes the baseline score as a control. The third column, you're going to see the number of observations go up, includes the baseline in a difference in difference framework. Okay? So you've got pre and post, in essence, week 0 and weeks 1 through 4, treated and non, and then their interaction, so that's that specification. And then the last column has more observations still, and the way that works is now I've included all of the ones where there's actually nothing interesting to record on the form. Okay, so we should expect that the effect is attenuated, and that's what we find. But in all of them, it's statistically significant. And in case you're worried that when we do 2 experiments, one in Akiti and one in Niger, if we just show you the thing that's statistically significant, then we're p-hacking. The important thing is that the p-values on the left are all way, way, way smaller than 0.05. And so it doesn't matter if you adjust for testing in 2 places. Okay, what does it mean in relation to Dave Evans and co-author's presentation yesterday? What are the things that people do? Do they do the easy things or do they do the hard things when they get improved scores on this form? So these are point estimates for the different things that go into the quality of filling out the form. And the basic thing is that there are effects on filling it out completely beforehand, but there are not effects in supplying additional receipts to substantiate with documentation any of the things that you've put on the form. So they did the easier things and they didn't do some of the harder things differentially. Maybe that's not a huge surprise. Okay, so as I explained, I'm going to take a treatment effect of the intervention, and then I'm going to look for whether the covariate has a direct level effect on, so let's say the gender ratio of the staff predicts your score in the absence of the intervention, how well you do this thing. And then there's an interaction of the treatment and the covariate. And that's going to be, does it explain treatment effect heterogeneity? And I include fixed effects for the area within which we randomized. Okay, so that's the coefficient is going to be that column. The interaction term is going to be this column, so this is the direct effect. So the number of hours open per day and the fraction female among staff, those predict the level of the score in the absence of the treatment. More women on staff seem to make this form get filled out better, so that would be consistent with kind of pro-sociality among female staff or something like that. On the other hand, the interaction in that instance is negative, maybe because there's a ceiling, you can't really get better than a certain amount, or maybe they feel, so actually this could be consistent with both. There's pro-sociality, you could say, that 0.22, so women are filling out the form better in the first place. On the other hand, when they see that stars are being put on the wall, that doesn't particularly help them or encourage them, motivate them. So the first thing I want to take away from this picture is that there's not much in that third column. There's not that many interactions that are statistically significant. In fact, there's only one. So when we go and we compare Ekiti to Niger, the question is, does this make the state dummy in treatment effects go away? Okay, the interaction of the state and treatment. And what I've got to tell you is that there are more women on staff as a fraction in Ekiti than in Niger. So actually, so then as you move to Niger, I'll show you this column. This is what the effect, I may have said it backwards. This is what the effect is after you control for the interaction between the covariate and treatment. This is what the state treatment effect interaction is. So the point is, it's 15 percentage points larger in Ekiti when you take into account any differential effect from log monthly outpatients. It's 16% larger when you look at the gender ratio. Every single one of these things, with the exception of this, where it ends up being underpowered, the covariate doesn't explain away the effect. And the only one where there was actually a story that I was going into this graph with doesn't do anything at all. So we sort of threw up our hands at the end of this and said, it's going to be harder than this to take a randomized trial in one place and move it to another. We thought that with this level of detail we would be able to do it. Turns out we couldn't. So I think the lesson to me and the lesson to all of us might be, what are the other things you would have imagined it would have been nice to get, and how can we get those things on surveys so that we can make the RCT lessons from one place become more portable to another? Thanks.
We have Gwen-Jiro as a discussant.
All right, so I have a few basic comments. So first of all, I think the idea of the paper is very interesting. And it could be very good if it had worked for resource-constrained countries to sort of this search of finding very cost-effective ways, because basically this project almost doesn't cost anything, except for the cost of reporting and going to the facilities every week to collect. But other than that, that's pretty much free. The other thing that I find interesting about this paper is that through social recognition, you try to make sort of bureaucracy work more sexy, like to find it more, to make people more, the staffers more willing to be, to do like sort of this perhaps repetitive task and something that is not very put forward in the performance of of a health clinic. You don't really often advertise how well your reporting goes. You are much more likely to report how much women you saved, how much condoms you distributed or something, but that's, I guess, one thing. So regarding the paper, I had two remarks, two or three. The first one is, so you're the recognition, the stickers you put it are at the facility level. They're not at the employee level. And what I find interesting is that this has more effect on the states in which there are more staffers. I mean, you're trying to make individual staffer work more efficiently and more thoroughly. And what you find is that through collective action, through like facility level action, you can actually have better individual performance for the ones who have larger staffs, which is which I find is interesting. The second remark I had was that basically one of the channels through which your project works is through public pressure. But what could explain, and again, that's maybe one just explanation, but you find that, so basically it's a sticker on the wall. It's very easy to understand. I mean, the star system is pretty easy to understand, but if you have sort of in the region, the Niger region, where the project doesn't work, you have much more illiterate population, which basically doesn't really understand the principle, maybe just the principle of the need to be thorough in their reporting activities. The last thing the last remark I had was the issue, maybe, well, that's not really in the paper, but to try to understand how we have so how this mechanism work. And basically the idea I had was maybe the possibility, so you showed that in the Niger states, in the Ekiti states, the population density was much higher, and especially the clinics density was also much higher. And so maybe because of this social pressure, and in fact, and again with the fact that population is more educated, there could be more facility and it could be more easy to communicate between facilities and to see, oh yeah, well, if you're like, I don't know, a few kilometers away, I can ask you, so how did you get your 5 stars this week? I only got 2 stars, and maybe if the facility is like 50 kilometers away, I don't know, I don't have any idea of the scale, obviously, but if it could be much more difficult. So that's.
Thank you.
Thanks for those comments. I'll make 1 or 2 responses. I think we were thinking along some similar lines. So one thing I wanted to highlight in what you mentioned is that maybe it was the low literacy in Niger State that made this not work terribly well. One of the things we had tried to do was make this relatively transparent, whatever your level of literacy. So this wasn't meant to be like a, end user license agreement that you get from Microsoft. This was supposed to be a number of stars that you could read even if you don't actually know any letters or words. But taking that point, it is the case that looking down here at looking at the graph that I showed you much earlier, or the patient education, which is right in the middle of this table, 70% of people had secondary schooling or more among the patients in Ekiti. That was only 43% in Niger. So that's a big difference. Maybe that's the thing that's responsible. But what's interesting is that within Ekiti and within Niger, we actually see quite a bit of variation in that. And so when you come down here, we can look within Ekiti at the variation at the facility level in the education that people have. And it's faintly predictive of the level. That's the 3rd row there. There's a 10 percentage point level, but there's no effect on the heterogeneity of the treatment effect with respect to that variable. I'm not showing the population density level term because it's absorbed by the local area fixed effect, which is the unit at which we randomized. But there's actually a lot of variation, again, in both Ekiti and Niger in the density of both facilities and population. So we try to look at that, and it does look like the more dense it is, the better the treatment effect is, but it's super imprecisely estimated. And when I include that interaction term, the difference in states and treatment effects is still, if you'd see that 4th from bottom, 16 percentage points. And when you control for patient education, it just almost doesn't move. So we agree, I think, to speak on behalf of my co-authors, with the instincts that you've had in thinking through why this might have worked or not. And we thought we sort of took our first best pass at testing for it and couldn't find it. I do think that the point here in looking at external validity across regions while fixing the implementer, fixing the time, fixing the national context, is that we see a lot of the discussion around external validity. Sometimes it goes to, is it an NGO or is it the government? Is it this or is it that? And it doesn't have to be that dichotomy. Here we've really fixed everything, including the implementer, and you can still get it to work really nicely in one place and yet not in another. So thank you for your comments, though. I think that those really nicely highlight some of the things we were looking at. It's a few minutes for questions, right?
Yes, we have another 4 minutes for questions. Please.
Thank you. Owen, this was really interesting. The questions I have are, how are visitors to the clinic or the facility supposed to understand the ranking? Okay, there's a star, but there's no ranking. So if there was a ranking, they might have a better sense of, the difference in this facility versus other facilities. So that might be something interesting to include. In terms of trying to influence the behavior, or how do you change behavior of the workers at the facility, it would be interesting to know what are the channels through which this would work. Maybe if they knew how they were ranked relative to other institutions, that could be one way. Another is if you're using radio as a way to communicate this information to a wider audience, that might have an effect. So I was just wondering. And also maybe the characteristics of the employees would be something to look into, whether that makes a difference. Bureaucratic quality, what are some of the characteristics of bureaucrats? Also, who are the bureaucrats reporting to, or how are they appointed? Is it from the center or is it the local government? In which case, maybe the quality of the local politicians could also be something that's important to look into. Thanks.
All good remarks, and maybe we should talk more after. Briefly to respond to a few of the points you raised. And yes, each time we see one of these things, it makes us think not only what else could you have measured along the lines of what are the individual characteristics of bureaucrats. We did, it turns out that a lot of them have very similar levels of qualification. So without really getting into it, we decided that wasn't an area where we would be in a good position to do anything other than PHAC because of the very fine distinctions in the levels of training. But if you thought maybe the measures of the motivation or the sort of inclination to provide public goods or something like that at the individual staff level, I think that makes sense. So we see ways we could have made this a different intervention that maybe would have been sharper, that is to say, to rank, to make it explicit that this is a competition between facilities rather than just a level. We sort of started with what we thought was the simplest, both logistically, you don't have to compute anything across facilities to award this, and in terms of relating to the literature, we saw this worked very well in Zambia in the work of Nava Ashraf, Oriana Bandira, Billy Jack. So this is something that we thought was a reasonable departure point, but you can imagine a competition variant of this. You can imagine pushing this harder with radio adverts, something like that. Anyway, I think I agree with all of the ideas that you've got. So this was just sort of a simple first take.
Okay, we have 1 minute. It should be very quick questions, so very brief questions, sorry. We have another one. First Marcel, and then we go down.
So my question was about, so basically you introduce an incentive, a labor incentive, so, right? So you have some workers and you introduce a task, and then you incentivize a task with social recognition. My question is basically, have you investigated whether different types of workers in these different states basically refuse to play the game. They refuse to respond to the incentive. They're not interested in being manipulated in this way. So I'm thinking about, because in labor relations, you can find people finding certain types of incentives illegitimate. They say, well, we're not going to play. Reject it. Maybe have you tried to investigate that?
Let me also take Rachel's question before I answer.
Yeah, quickly, just when we reviewed all the health RCTs in a Handbook of Health Economics chapter, we found very similar effects on when we compared RCTs on consumers. So consumers were responding in very similar ways across different countries. Health bureaucrats, on the other hand, there was much less similarity in results across countries, and the obvious answer to that is how they respond to incentives depends on what the bureaucratic structure they're working in, which would be different across your two states.
Right, so exactly right. And so one way you can kind of lead this paper is to say it's about the institutional setting in which these two groups of bureaucrats live. And if those institutional settings are different in other ways than the ones that we've measured, then that could be responsible for all of this. What governs their professional advancement could be totally different. I will say, with respect to Marcel's very good point, that we don't see almost any, I've got a histogram and an appendix. Almost everybody fills out the form. So you might think that the new task in and of itself is seen as kind of an affront. Why should I do this new thing? We don't see people responding negatively to the new task. We see people mostly trying to fill out the form. Even in Niger, where it's sort of like a 60% quality, people are filling it out. I can't say whether they took the stars. We thought that if there was a characteristic that predicted whether they would take the stars, take offense at the sticking up of the stars, then that would predict the treatment effect heterogeneity, and we didn't feel like we could get at that. But I'd love to talk to you more about it. And I think I'm out of time. Thanks very much for your questions and comments.
Good. So I present a paper on the economics of missionary expansion. It's a paper with Remy Chedwab and a colleague at Sussex University, Felix Meyer-Soselhausen. And I will be very quick coming to what this paper is doing. So what we want to do is to provide some causal estimates about the determinants of Christian expansion in Ghana. That's our first contribution. The second contribution is to look a bit more closely about conditions under which shocks, historical shocks, natural experiments are really exogenous, and studies avoid compression of history. What do I mean with compression of history? Well, typically people use something in the past and say we can relate it to today, but actually there's a dynamic process which leads to the point where they have their snapshot. And there's a dynamic process from going from the snapshot to outcomes today. And I think it's very important to unbundle these dynamics in order to understand whether really your experiment is exogenous or what type of control variables you would need. We focus on the literature using establishment of Christian missions as a natural experiment. And there's an expanding literature. There's now about 50 studies around that link mission stations, European mission stations, to human capital outcomes, education, religion, and also culture. Okay, so when you think about what is culture, well, religion is an important ingredient of that. Now, what we are saying is, when you start thinking about what these missionaries were doing, you get to a kind of a target function, and then you think that these locations, they're endogenous if they behave as non-profit organizations, and they need to consider costs and benefits. Okay, so we set up a small model or conceptual framework where we make clear what we think, how these missionaries behaved, and set and chose their locations. We created a new annual panel data of missions, so we go really back to the first missionary arriving in Ghana, 1751. It's annual data up to 1932. You see we are really trying to get at the dynamics. We show that the locational choice is driven by costs and benefits. Missionaries go to coastal areas, to coastal grids. They first go to non-malarial grids. Things change over time. It is a matter about the costs and how costs change over time. They settle in pacified areas and connected and also more developed areas. We do this for Ghana because we have very good data on Ghana, but we try to add a bit of external validity using mission maps for Africa from two major studies. One is from Nunn, who is essentially the seminal study who started all this type of business, looking at mission stations and how they affect outcomes today, and another one by Kashi and Rueda. The second thing is what we want to contribute at is to emphasize their biases and in historical sources, and especially in historical maps, and they matter if they are non-classical measurement errors. So you can see this is an example of such a map that you can find in a Christianary missionary atlas. Green dots are, I think, the Protestants, red dots are the Catholics. You can find the locations, and this map atlases of 1924, and voila, you have the locations of all mission stations in 1924. Now this is a source of a map. Now we can actually look at other sources, government sources, missionary sources. And then what you find out is that these maps are only representing about between 2% and 80% of the mission stations. So we did this for these two maps that are heavily in use. And you can see, for example, Madagascar, they show only about 2% of the mission stations. Tanzania, it's a bit better, so representation is about 80%, but Ghana, only 5% of the mission stations. So there's clear measurement error. Now, do you care about measurement error? Well, it would be nice to get rid of it, right? Because this means you get rid of attenuation bias, but actually as long as you find positive result, it's attenuation bias. Wait a second. It really depends on whether your measurement error is classical. What we are showing is that the measurement error is related, or what these maps observe are the very early missions. They are driven by different factors than what you think. So even though you say, this is for 1900, this is for 1924, we show that these mission maps are related to a different year, okay? And you have to be careful about this. So let's think about kind of a conceptual framework, because it then gets clear about what the dynamics are. So we think that missionaries are getting utility from converting souls. And they can do this at various locations, and we can essentially sum up all the utilities across space, and then you have essentially to say what this utility function is about. Now, it's a non-profit organization, so we start saying it's really just utility, but what matters is the membership. What should also matter is the price that the natives are willing to pay. Now, there's one issue about, well, how do they pay? One way how they pay is in terms of time. The other thing is also in terms of donations. And I think this is really underestimated because local communities had to pay for the services, okay? Also in terms of donations, okay? Then there's an issue that not all, that mission societies have some intrinsic value that they find and they're willing to pay for some souls, or willing to spend for some souls more than for others. Well, we take care about this with this kind of lambda parameter. But what matters is also the costs and the fixed costs. So they are really operating under a budget constraint, and you should think then essentially about these costs and what is driving fixed costs. How's the dynamics? Well, the first thing is there's an initial investment. It's coming from outside. These are the donations from the motherland. So churches in the US or in Europe, they pay so that missionaries could be sent. Over time, though, these profits are reinvested and to expand in the colony. Now you can come up with a profit function essentially by this idea that what is your willingness to pay to get a person, okay, for a certain soul. Good, so we get at monetary values. What's important is that there is a budget constraint, and that this budget constraint is also affecting essentially then your expansion, because you're reinvesting this into the colony. Now, when you think about this, how should this work? It's essentially an optimal decision is to settle first with the best locations, with the highest income places, and where you get a lot of members very easily, where you don't need to pay a lot. Okay? Further on with diffusion, you need to expand, and more souls are getting more costly. Okay? So this is the dynamics behind that. So the movement expands by converting the best locations first, and then the less good locations until it essentially runs out of money, or everyone is converted, they run out of locations. But there should be a clear pattern of who gets a mission station first and later on. What are the implications? So the first thing is obviously placement of missions are endogenous. There are lots of factors that you can think about of benefits and costs. Now there's an issue that these benefits and costs of mission locations, they're also likely to affect this kind of long-term development that people are saying missionaries are influencing. Good. So what is the data for Ghana? We assembled a complete data set from 1751 to 1932. Unit of observations, we're using grid cells, 11 to 11 kilometers shape. We use a very different source. We don't use atlases. It's British colonial blue books. It's ecclesiastical returns. This is what missionaries are sending off to the government, saying these are the places where we provide services. And they also tell you what type of services they provide. Okay? In terms, for example, schooling. Good, so we have also data on intensive margin, the number of mission stations in a grid cell, intensive margin, the main station. This is essentially some kind of, you want to have central places where you can visit outer stations very easily. When you think about endogeneity, if you just pick up the main stations, you have a problem because you're picking up those ones which are centrally located and which are better developed. Okay? Good, so we add a lot of explanatory variables that are associated with costs and benefits. It's kind of a reduced form. So geography, we have historical malaria, we have coastal access, we look at the political boundaries, how they changed over time. We have information about where the head chiefs were residing. In 1901, we know the navigable rivers, historical trade routes, railroads, roads, population over every 10 years and 30 years. And we also know something about economic activities like slave trade, markets, cash crops, and mining. This is the evolution of missions over time, the black line. So we start, look at 1840, so we cut off the 1751 because nothing is really happening there. Okay, so there's one mission station going off and off, but essentially it's just one. We don't look at this very at the very beginning, okay? So 1840, one cell, you see it's like increasing slowly, but then it's increasing exponentially. Interestingly, so number of cells with a school, what type of missions get a school? And actually at the beginning, the early missions, every one of them had a school, but later on they expanded without providing a service, without providing a school. When you think about education later on, this is important, right? Because you would think that only these missions at the beginning should probably play a role because they have a school. The later churches, they don't provide a schooling. It's Sunday school, right? Learn your 10 commandments. This is what you learn. This is not what we think about human capital. Good, so this is the spatial diffusion. That's the picture in 1854. So we start with just 4 cross-sections. So get a kind of a feeling of what is driving this diffusion process. You see everything is scattered along the coast. It's just Protestants in 1854. 1875, Protestants are moving inwards. They are going to the northeast. 1903, still northeast. They are going to the center, western part, no single mission station. 1903, you see already the Catholics are coming. This is the picture in 1932. When you know a bit about Ghana, this looks pretty much as if every place more or less gets a kind of a mission, okay? Good. So we start with just a simple cross-section and getting an idea about the covariates. What we're doing is essentially here a mission dummy, linear probability model with a mission dummy as a dependent variable. We look at long differences, so we are controlling for the missions in the cells in the previous periods, 4 cross-sections. Okay, so the first time that we include the lag is for missions in 1875. Reason being is we want to show that, or look at the changes of the determinants over time. And then we have here some potential local determinants. This is cross-section, but we have a panel, so what we can do is using self-fixed effects, here fixed effects, and then just look at the time varying variables. Summary of findings, regression is very long, so I won't go into detail, but what we find is that malaria matters, but only for the early mission stations. Later on, malaria doesn't matter, okay? These locations are expanding into the malarious regions. Coastal proximity, African resistance, it's essentially the Ashanti Kingdom that blocked Christians once this African kingdom went into got into British rule. Christians were expanding, okay? Historical trade routes, they matter. And they only matter for the time when they were important. So we had historical trade routes for 1850, and what we observe is that they matter for the locations in 1850. From 1900, 1924, they don't matter. What matters then is when the railroads are built, okay? So we find significant coefficients once the railroads are there. Built 1898, once the roads are becoming accessible. Rural-urban population is also significant. It's again, you have some population movement. It's always the population variable that is closest to the year that we look at, which is significant, okay? Economic activity, we look at cash crops and also mines. There are positive correlations. This cash crops means income, okay? Mines means also income. There are towns developing around mines. There's more income to spread. This is where missionaries would go. Then we look at these other measures of mission locations, so essentially conditional or mission dummy, and what we find is that essentially the best locations get the best missions, okay? So if you have a railroad, you're much more likely to get a main station, you get more likely to get a missionary school as well, and you have more missions in total, okay? So overall, the best locations, the best missions can be found in the best locations, okay? So here you find exactly the source of indigeneity. Oh, I have to stop. Really? Okay, good. Causality. So give me 2 minutes because I want to say something about causality. So we look essentially at 3 factors. So one thing is malaria, and it's medical progress that we look at. So quinine became available around 1840. Missionaries started to use that. As a result of that, mortality dropped. When you think about costs, this means the cost of providing missionary services got reduced. And we observed then to missionary locations to expand into malarial regions in Ghana. Now, the interesting point here is that we can essentially check that the reduced mortality only is reduced for Europeans, not Africans. But the point here is that essentially the Africans are driving forward the diffusion. Reason being, once you have enough Europeans, how you can expand mission stations is to have African priests. And this is what is happening. They are cheaper, they are more productive once you train them. So they're spreading into these malarious regions. Railroads, just a very quick, what we are using with lots of identification strategies. One, which I find most convincing, myself most convincing, is using placebo railroad lines. So railroad lines that were proposed but were not built, but in terms of economic potential, they had the same ones that were really built. So here you see the actual railroad lines, and here you have ones that were proposed but not built for random reasons. So one is the war ended too soon, so you didn't need a railroad. The other one is governors who favored these railroads but then retired or died. So that's the reason they were not built. So we can compare this to these placebo railroads. And what we find is that we only find these mission stations along the railroads. We can also use this panel structure, and we find it's no effect of the lead. So it's not that the mission stations were there first, and then the railroads were coming, but it's the other way around. Good. Cash crops. Here we look, we use Bartik-style shift chair analysis. The nice thing about Ghana is that there were cash crop booms of different cash crops. So the first one is palm oil, okay? And these are export values over time. You see rubber, this is the rubber boom of the 1900. You have gold, which is picking up in exports in around 1900, and cocoa, big factor in around 1910. The nice thing about this is that these cash crops, or these gold mining, they happen at different places and at different times. So what we are using, and this is exogenously driven, right, by export prices. So what we're thinking about is we know where cocoa was produced approximately. Now we know that production is increasing. So what we are doing is we predict the production value of cells given these overall national production values. And what we find is positive effects of these incomes. So I can show you the regressions. The elasticity is pretty much the same. It's about 0.02. We can look at what is these leads. They are not important. We can add ethnic group fixed effects. We can also look at whether these busts and booms, gold, there's a bust, there's a boom and there's a bust. Palm oil, same thing. Boom and then a bust. Whether these mission stations survive, and we find that they stay on. Good. Can I have 2 minutes? 2 minutes. Very quick. So going back to this question, what do these maps represent? We have data from, so here from 1840 to around 1930, and what we can do is just run a correlation looking at the cells that have a mission in our data and a mission in the room map and in the Dennis Beach and Farm map. And what you see here is the correlation of our data with these atlases. And this is room, okay? So the best correlation, highest correlation with these mission locations and these atlases are the early mission stations. Over time, with diffusion, with adding more and more missions, these mission maps become less accurate. But the point here is essentially these maps are saying, oh, this map is measuring 1900, this map is measuring 1924. No, your map is really measuring 1840. Now, when you think about causal links, that's important because your control is railroad 1900. No, railroad 1900 or the missions are not causing railroads 1900. Your control variable is useless. You need to check the historical trade routes. This is the control variable that you really need. Okay? So, last slide. We looked at long-run effects of this mission dummy on Christianity, economic development, structural change, and education in Ghana and then also for Africa. What we find and what we expect and what we find is very strong effects for beach and room. Reason being is they show the most endogenous mission stations, the earliest ones with the best locations. In the best locations. The effects are very close to when we use our data for Ghana and if we use the earliest main missions, because this is what they represent. Okay? But unconditional effects, they decrease as we use later missions. Okay? This is essentially you're expanding and you're then expanding to poorer and poorer places. So when you use later and later data, you pick up essentially this indigeneity effect. Once you include proper controls that take into account of this compression of history, the effect should decrease. And the effects are pretty large. So here you see this is for the room map. No, this is for the room map. The unconditional effect is one mission station is increasing light intensity by 500%. You use standard controls, it's decreasing somewhat. If you use our controls, it's decreasing, no, it's going down by almost a factor of 8. Okay? Here you can see the selection bias. So if you use the standard mission map, mission stations, and if you use our data for the same year, you see that the effect is decreasing. So essentially this is for Ghana, this is for Africa, we get pretty much the same result. Sorry that I talked too long.
I'm going to use my -3 minutes to make a couple of comments really quickly, violating certain laws of physics. So the first thing I want to mention is that I'm very excited to read the revised version of this paper. He has described in very anodyne terms, it was prior to the introduction of quinine, relatively high cost for Europeans to do various things like missionary activity in Africa. By high cost, he means they all died, okay? So the probability that a missionary died within 4 years in sub-Saharan Africa was above 50% until the introduction of quinine. So this was like, to say high cost is an understatement. An exciting thing about this exercise, and it reminds me of an exercise of which I'm a part, is that the first time somebody wants to ask one of these really interesting historical questions, you've got to assemble a data set, and it's usually quite a small piece of the data set that you could assemble. And so that's reflected in kind of the earlier papers on this. And so what you're doing is this kind of thankless exercise of bringing in a much richer and much more complete set of data. And so then that's going to do two things. One is it's going to reduce the scope for measurement error, and that means both you'd have attenuation bias, okay? So if you've just got a huge amount of measurement error, this is going to allow more precise estimation of coefficients in terms of standard errors and in terms of bias. But more importantly, the early mission data, meaning the earliest missions, and I'm going to repeat this line that you used, were built in the most endogenous places. And so you could think that the set of controls that you might want to bring in, and I'm just going to go back one slide because I had only looked at this Africa one. I hadn't seen this one that's specific to, this is Ghana, this is C12. Is that right? This is your slide. Is this Ghana? Or is it? Sorry, so this one's all of Africa?
Next slide is all Africa.
And this one is?
This is Ghana.
This is Ghana. I mean, I think it's really remarkable how much the coefficient changes. And if we go to all of Africa, you can get a lot more data points, and so you can get a lot more precision. And so I think you could think, as you look from the fall in coefficients from 2 to 1.8 to 1.3, that even after you include more controls, there might still be an effect there, and there's still enough precision that you might still detect an effect as you push further down this line. And so the one suggestion I want to make there is along the lines of Emily Oster's formalization of the Al-Tanji Elder Tabor paper is if you could get more controls that were like this in terms of their covariance structure, what would that leave your coefficient at? Your R-squared actually is getting pretty high, considering that you're using only historical characteristics to predict nighttime lights. You're not going to get an R-squared of 1. You should never get an R-squared of 1 in something like this. So the upper bound there is probably 0.4, 0.5. So there's probably still something there, but it's a lot smaller than what the literature might have thought up to now. The one other constructive suggestion I wanted to make is that I wonder if you can formalize, you're thinking about the expansion of missionaries in terms of the costs and benefits of going to different locations. And so in one regression specification, you're showing that it's the railroad lines that matter, whereas in an earlier specification, in an earlier year, you're showing that it's the historical trade routes that matter. I wonder if you could kind of put all that together into one variable that sort of says, at any given time, the costs of transportation from point A to point B. And so then you can just include that rather than having specifications where, you know, here it's bricks and here it's wood and here it's this other thing. Where it's constantly changing. But I think that's the direction you're moving with your paper, and I found it very interesting. Thanks.
Negative. How many minutes for comments?
5 minutes, so I'm collecting questions, I guess.
Hi, so thanks for the paper. This is obviously interesting. Yeah, I had a question, because so you first show that the best missions are in the best locations, and then that these earliest missions are the ones that have a stronger association with urbanization and light density. So do you think that that is only a geographical effect, or is there some kind of missionary effect? And of course, this is hard to answer.
Okay. So I'm not quite sure, but I understood this correctly. So geographic factors, if geography is constant, so we have we have a panel data set, and we have specifications where we just have self-fixed effects, where actually everything geography should be constant. So I think what we are emphasizing is this dynamics. So geography is constant, but once cocoa prices go up, people start growing cocoa, people get rich, and this is where the missionaries want to get in. The interesting point is essentially cocoa prices going down, but these mission stations stay. But for you, essentially, when you take a snapshot, you need to know, okay, what has determined their snapshot at the moment. And I think, I'm not sure whether I answered your question by this. This means essentially you have to think more clearly about not just taking one variable, but you have to think more clearly about how you get to this point to develop proper control variables.
Talked about the fact that about the cost and benefits, that they went to the pacified area, right? I didn't see any control for that, but I'm just curious about that choice. So did they face some resistance when, in some areas, when they were expanding, and how do you control for that?
So this is the Ashanti Kingdom, and what Africans did were to kidnap missionaries, and this was essentially also during the war with Britain. And the Ashanti Kingdom had also soldiers coming into the Gold Coast colony. And you see actually that missionaries keep a safe distance from the supposedly, from the river which is supposed to be the boundary. But then the Brits won. They were annexing this Ashanti Kingdom, and as soon as they were annexing this Ashanti Kingdom, there was peace, and they expanded them to this Ashanti Kingdom. Okay, so this is what we think with pacification. There's some discussion in the literature whether the flag followed the cross or the cross followed the flag. Our data would say the cross followed the flag. So they were really keeping a safe distance from African resistance because it was costly, right? So there were kidnappings and killings. Yes, so what we are doing is we are using as a dummy variable cells for within Ashanti Kingdom. And so this is time varying because the Ashanti Kingdom ceased, and then you can switch it off later on. Yeah. Other questions? Okay, everyone is keen for the tea. Thank you so much for coming and for these stimulating questions.